exercise 17, we're looking at the gross anatomy of the brain. So to start with this, just a brief review of what our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system look like. So we've got our overarching nervous system, and it is split into two branches, the CNS and the PNS. This is going to be the central nervous system, and this is going to be the peripheral. So the central nervous system will be composed of two structures, the brain, which we're going to focus on today, and the spinal cord, which will be the next exercise. And the PNS is actually going to be split into two branches. So the PNS is split into your sensory branch. Sensory branch is all incoming information, also called the afferent information. And then you're going to have the motor branch, which is all outgoing information, also called the efferent information. So CNS and PNS, your PNS is split into sensory and your motor, and then your motor branch further will branch into two categories. And you will have your somatic motor movements, and this is going to be your voluntary. So this would be your skeletal muscle. And then you're going to have your autonomic. And so your autonomic movements are going to be the ones that are involuntary. So within your motor branch of your peripheral nervous system, you've got your somatic or your voluntary. This is your skeletal muscles. And then your autonomic or your involuntary, which is going to be your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, and your glands. So you're going to have somatic and autonomic. Your autonomic will actually break down a little bit further, but for this class, we're going to just focus on these right here. So when we're looking at the brain, we are going to be in the CNS. So our brain during development, we're just going to do a brief overview of what is occurring during development to get our currently organized structure of the brain. So we're going to start during development as this thing called a neural tube, and it looks essentially just a tube, long tube folded in on itself. And then by week 4 of development, after fertilization, it will split into 3 branches. So kind of around here-ish is when we're going to be branching. So up here we'll have 3 sections that will be split into. The first one will be an area called the prosencephalon, and this will be the top part or the most anterior part of our neural tube. The middle section will become our mesencephalon, and our last section will become our rhombencephalon. So this will happen around week 4, and then they'll continue to divide and develop, and around week 5, we'll actually branch a little bit further. So your prosencephalon will branch into 2 areas. It'll be your telencephalon, and your telencephalon will then be followed by your diencephalon. Your mesencephalon actually stays your mesencephalon. That does not change. And then your rhombencephalon also will split into 2, and it will split into your metencephalon and your myelencephalon. So these are the branches of your neural tube during development that will again eventually lead into certain structures. So in our mature brain, your telencephalon will become our cortex, which we're going to talk about. Your diencephalon will become the thalamus or the hypothalamus, but then also the retina. So that's where your eyes will come from. Your mesencephalon will become your brainstem and your midbrain. Your metencephalon will become the pons or the cerebellum. And then your myelencephalon will also become part of your brainstem. So as we start talking about the areas of the brain, this is how and when they develop. during this process of neural development. So we're going to start with telencephalon first and really just focus on that. So this is going to be the cerebral cortex. And so this is the most external part of the brain that you see. So there are going to be two cerebral hemispheres. So there's a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, and they are split right down the middle. And there's some anatomical kind of terminology we're going to talk about that are used as landmarks. So whenever you see the term gyrus or gyri, that is a term that will actually mean a ridge or a bump. Then if you see the term sulcus or sulci, that will be a term that's kind of a groove. So the outside layer of your brain is not going to be flat like this. What it's actually going to be is it's going to be convoluted like this. And this allows for an increase in surface area. So with this folded pattern all over our cerebral cortex, we've increased our surface area. So whenever there is a groove or a valley, this would be the gyrus. Whereas anytime there's the bump or the hilltop, there would be the sulcus, and then the gyrus. I got them mixed up. So that's the two characteristics that you'll have in the brain for us to be able to distinguish where things are. There's also going to be another characteristic that is called a fissure. And a fissure is going to be essentially a very, very deep groove. So if this is going to be a kind of just a little valley, if we were to be putting this on adding to our groove, our fissure, it would essentially look like this. So instead of it being a valley, it's more like going to be the Grand Canyon. These fissures and these sulci and these gyruses are what give us our anatomical external part of the brain. So there's a couple main parts when you see the brain that these are using to give a landmark barrier. So right here would be your central, it is a groove. So this is going to be the central sulcus that splits the front half of the brain from the back half of the brain. There is going to be the longitudinal sulcus. So this is, if you're looking, these are your eyes. So this is the anterior part of the brain, and this is the posterior. Or if you were to look at it where you're looking at the brain kind of like this, and here's your eyes. So this is the anterior and this is the posterior, and this would be you're looking down at the top of it. You've got one that goes right down the middle that splits the right and the left. That will be the longitudinal fissure. So the longitudinal fissure will split right and left. The central sulcus will split front and back. You'll also have this section right here, which is the lateral sulcus, which splits the temporal from the parietal and the frontal lobe. And then there's going to be one kind of back here. It's a little bit harder to see, which is going to be your parieto-occipital sulcus. So these are used as the landmarks to kind of break up the other areas of the brain. So what we're actually breaking up are going to be the primary sensory areas of the brain and the primary motor areas of the brain. So we're just going to briefly go through these within the brain and look at this. So when we're looking at the areas of our brain to start with, we're just going to do a big brain, kind of like that. So when we're looking at our brain like this, we are going to have 5 lobes. So you will have the frontal lobe, you have the parietal, you will have the occipital. These are the same as the bones. Temporal, and then there will be the insula, which is going to be a deeper. So your frontal lobe, if we have our central sulcus right here, redraw that. If we have our central sulcus right here, this front half is going to be the frontal lobe. This part right here is going to be your temporal. This part right here, the back side, will be the occipital. And then kind of drawing a fake line kind of to distinguish, this will be the parietal. So these are the lobes of the brain, but we've got some primary and some sensory motor areas. So we're going to do the sensory first. So the first primary sensory area is going to be right here. And this is going to be our primary sensory cortex. So this is where you will have the sensations that you are processing of touch, pain, and temperature. So that is where you're going to feel your primary sensory cortex. You also are going to have an area that is in your temporal lobe that is around here. And that is going to be your primary auditory cortex. So this is where you're going to be processing the sense of sound primarily. So primary auditory cortex. Then you'll also have another sensory area. That's going to be where you're going to process visual information from your eyes. And that's going to be back here in the back part of the occipital lobe. This will be your primary visual cortex. You have a couple other primary sensory cortexes right around here in the parietal lobe. This is where you're going to have the cortex that is related to gustatory information, or this is going to be your taste. So this is our gustatory cortex, or our taste. And then underneath here, that's hidden from this perspective so you can't see it, is going to be the olfactory cortex. And that is where you will have the sense of smell being processed. Okay, so when we're looking at these are the primary sensory areas. But if we were to take the primary motor areas, they're going to be very similar. So right here in the front of your central sulcus, there is an gyrus, and this is going to be your primary motor area. So this is going to be responsible for the large skeletal muscle movements that you make. So this is the voluntary muscle. And then you're going to have two other areas that one of is related to motor and how they go together in a couple ways. So you have one area right here that will be called Broca's area. And so yes, it is motor, but specifically this is going to be verbal motor or expressive motor, or using your muscles of the mouth. So this is speech production, Broca's area. It is motor because you're using your muscles of your mouth and throat, but specifically related to speech production. And then you're going to have another area that is related to understanding speech. So right around here, you're going to have Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area is also involved in language, but this is not going to be speech production. This is going to be understanding speech. So if someone else is talking, you are able to understand what they are saying. Whether or not you are able to talk would be Broca's area. So the difference between Broca's and Wernicke's is Broca does have a motor component. Wernicke's is being able to process and understand, but they are both related to language. So these are the general large areas of the brain. We do use the rest of the other areas of the brain. It's where we're processing and putting together and synthesizing information. So this is the general external perspective of the brain. What we also then need to look at is if we take our brain and you kind of, split it in half, essentially here's our one half, here's our second, here's our second half. If we have right down the middle is our lateral fissure or longitudinal fissure, we are now splitting this right down the middle. And if we do, you get this perspective. And inside, it will actually look not like this external picture, but it will actually look like this. And then inside, there is this massive structure that connects the right and the left sides of the brain. So this is going to be what you generally, that's a really bad brain. So we're going to make it a little bit bigger. There we go. This is generally what you're going to see when you're looking at the brain. So when you're looking at this is the cross section of the brain. You're splitting it in half and looking at it down the mid-sagittal plane. There's some structures that I want you to be able to find at this perspective. Understand where the corpus callosum is and identify that structure. The thalamus, which is a deep internal structure, that's the integration of all of our sensory information. Underneath the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which has a lot of information and handles our metabolism and keeps our just homeostatic world going. And then I want you to be able to find the pituitary gland. All of these are going to be around right somewhere in here because these are our diencephalon structures. I also want you to be able to find a couple other structures that are more brainstem related, and these are going to be your pons and your medulla and the cerebellum. So all of these structures are going to be a little lower, and they will be found here. So those are the structures you need to be able to find from this internal perspective. Okay, there's two more topics and thoughts for this particular section and for exercise 17. So we've got our development and we've done our telencephalon and the external structures of the brain. Here's the internal structures of this brain. But one thing that's really cool about this entire organization is that there is very protective layers built into our brain and our spinal cord. So basically our CNS. And one of the main ways that we are actually going to protect our brain and spinal cord is with our skull, which we know. So we've got our brain, then we're going to have that outside layer of our skull. And that is actually protecting, and then we're going to have our vertebrae or our backbone. That is a bony structure protecting our brain and spinal cord. But what you're also going to have is you're going to have liquid inside that will then flow all the way down, and then you'll have liquid all the way around the outside of the brain and the outside of the spinal cord. And this liquid also gives it a protection. And there are 3 layers of connective tissue that will help hold the brain in place, keeps the liquid where it needs to be, and be an external layer of protection. So with our these layers are going to be called the 3 meninges. And so these 3 meninges are going to be protective layers. So the first one you're going to have is the outermost. So it is the one that is external, closest to the skull. This is going to be called the dura mater. Dura does actually mean hard. Mater means mother. So this is a hard mother. So it's a double layer. It's the most external layer. It's the one that's attached to the skull. The internal layer is going to be called the arachnoid matter. Arachnoid stands for spider, so this is built because it actually does look a little bit like a spider web, but those are due to the thread-like projections of the vessels, arteries, and veins. So that's what's going on with the arachnoid matter. And then the most internal, the one that is closest to the actual structure of the brain, is the pia matter. So if dura means hard, pia means soft. So this is the soft mother, and this is the most internal, where it is going to be highly vascularized. So these three meningeal layers will actually be surrounding the entire brain and spinal cord. And then in this little section right here, our arachnoid, you'll have something called a subarachnoid space. And this is where you will actually find this fluid that I drew over here. So that's another way that our brain is actually protected, which is going to be with cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And your cerebrospinal fluid is built in a couple very specific, one very unique structure in the brain, and it will provide a liquid barrier and liquid buffer around the vein, around the brain and spinal cord. So CSF is a very important part. Okay, so the biggest takeaway from this exercise is actually to look at our cranial nerves. So if we were to take this image of our brain right here, and we look at it from a different perspective than any of the others, and we essentially look at it right here, you're going to see this is the brain, but it is going to be the bottom of the brain. So we've taken the brain, and rather than looking at the top, we are now looking at the bottom of it. So this area would be the area that we're going to look at the bottom of the brain, where we are going to find our cranial nerves. So our cranial nerves are part of our peripheral nervous system. And when you get to lecture, the cranial nerves are not included in this same chapter because they will be included in the chapter for peripheral nervous system. So it's a little bit tricky. But these are technically part of the peripheral nervous system. There are 12 pairs. So there will be a 12 right and 12 left. So everything is going to be paired up. Most of these are coming from the head and neck to the brain. Only one of them will go into the abdomen. And what's cool about these is they are actually named for the structures that they control. So they're very, very, very easy. But these will all have a specific function. So a cranial nerve is carrying information. A nerve is carrying information. So cranial nerve can carry sensory information, or it can carry motor information, or it can carry both. So these are our three options that we're going to have to talk through. So with our 12 pairs of cranial nerves, we're going to make a chart. And we're going to start with the number of our cranial nerve. We're going to do the name. And then we're going to do the function. I'm going to get a little bit more room because sometimes the name can be a little long. So for our 12 pairs, we're going to follow this process. All of our cranial nerves are going to be named off of a Roman numeral. Usually we'll start with CN, but Roman numeral 1. So cranial nerve 1, the name will be the olfactory nerve. So this is going to be a sensory. So we're going to have three options for function: sensory, motor, or both. So olfaction is a sensory information type pathway. So it will only be sensory. That's what the S will mean. We'll write that out for this first one. It will only carry sensory information, and it is carrying the sensory information of smell, olfactory. The next one is cranial nerve 2, which is going to be optic nerve. So the optic nerve is going to also be carrying sensory information, but what it is carrying is going to be sensory information specific to vision. Optic. And you're going to have cranial nerve 3, which is ocular motor. So the ocular motor nerve has a new function because it's in the name. This will have a motor component. And what it's going to be responsible for moving is going to be the muscles of the eyes. So because it's a motor component, it means that it's moving these muscles, which are moving something else. So this is an ocular motor. We're moving the muscles of the eyes. Then we've got the next section, which is cranial nerve 4. And this is going to be the trochlear nerve. So the trochlear nerve is also going to be similar to the third one in that it is motor. So I'm just going to do an M. And this is also the muscles of the eyes. So your eyes have 6 pairs of muscles. So this is a 1 pair and 2 pair of muscles of the eyes. So there is one outstanding movement of the eyes that we need to talk about. So then the next one is cranial nerve 5, and this is the trigeminal nerve. So the trigeminal nerve is actually going to be the first mixed nerve. It has both. So its sensory information is going to be the sensory input of the face, taking all of that touch, pain, and temperature information back to the brain. But then it also has a motor component, and this motor is going to be the muscles of the mouth, specifically those involved with mastication, which means chewing. So your trigeminal nerve of the face is sending information to your brain about the overall sensation in the face, and then providing motor output to the muscles that are related to chewing in your mouth and mastication. So trigem nerve is the first one that is both. Then we're going to have cranial nerve 6, and that is the abducens. I always spell this one right or wrong. Abducens nerve. And the abducens nerve is going to be motor only, and this is our third set of muscles of the eyes. So this is our third set of muscles that will control that area. Then you're going to have cranial nerve 7, which is a facial nerve. And based on the name, it tells you a little bit about where it innervates. So the facial nerve is going to be mixed. It will have both sensory and motor information. The sensory information that your facial nerve is picking up is very similar to the sensory information of the trigeminal or cranial nerve 5. So the facial nerve has both sensory and motor. Its sensory information that it can pick up is the taste buds plus other sensory information on the tongue. And its motor output is going to be responsible for moving the muscles of the face. So this is the general facial expressions, movement of your mouth, movement of your eyebrows that will be innervated by your facial nerve. Then we're going to have cranial nerve 8, and if I had to pick a favorite one, it would be this one, mainly because the name is a little bit confusing. So this is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulocochlear nerve. So vestibular system and the cochlea. This is a sensory neuron or group of neurons. So the vestibulocochlear sensory information, it will be processing equilibrium and it will be processing balance. So how you are hearing things as well as the ability to process your own balance in space and your equilibrium. Okay, so moving on, we have cranial nerve 9, which is going to be glossopharyngeal. And the glossopharyngeal nerve is going to be a mixed nerve, meaning it carries both sensory and motor. The sensory information that this one will carry is going to be the tonsils, tongue, taste, pressure. So it's going to be all of the areas that are more refined and ongoing than the actual vestibular cochlear nerve. So again, this is also be the tongue and the taste. So what's different about the glossopharyngeal versus the facial nerve is the glossopharyngeal, you are essentially presented with this option and you can choose to do it or choose to not do it. Whereas with your other ones that we were talking about, where it's the taste, pressure, tongue, and that is going to be where you, those nerves that is carrying that information is going to be specific to parts of the mouth and tongue that the glossopharyngeal is not. So it kind of splits the tongue in half. The last one is cranial nerve 10, and this will be the vagus nerve. This is the most important nerve that you will have and talk about in your cranial nerves. The big reason that this is going to be important, it is carrying both sensory and motor information, but the big reason that the vagus nerve is important is because not only does it interact with the brain and areas within the face, head, all of those pieces which we've discussed so far, this one will actually travel to the viscera. So this is responsible for bringing information back to the central nervous system about how your overall internal state is. So your vagus nerve, sensory, is going to be sensory input from your insides or from your viscera. So blood pressure, pain, uncomfortable, all of those are going to be communicated via the vagus nerve. And then the motor output will actually going to be the muscles of the heart, so cardiac muscle, and your smooth muscle are going to be able to be controlled by this vagus nerve. And it's not nerves, it's just nerve. So the next one we're going to have is cranial nerve 11. This is the accessory nerve. This is technically also both. It does carry both sensory and motor information. The sensory is so small that we're not really going to focus on that, but we do know it carries sensory information. But its motor information is going to be responsible for moving the muscles of the throat. Specifically, the muscle sternocleidoid mastoid muscle, which you guys should know where it is and kind of what it does. This accessory nerve is responsible for producing the movement of that muscle. Even though there is a sensory component, it was not one that is targeted or focused on. Cranial nerve 12 is the last one, and this is the hypoglossal nerve. And so this is also going to be a mixed nerve. It will carry both sensory and motor information. Just like cranial nerve 11, the hypoglossal nerve does not focus so much on sensory. It does have it. It is considered both, but we will not be focusing on that. Whereas the motor output that is given by the hypoglossal nerve is going to be the muscles of the tongue. So we have quite a few innervated areas that are responsible for moving and manipulating your tongue. So these are the cranial nerves 1 through 12. What you do need to know these is you need to know them by name. You need to know them by number. So if I were to say, what does the vestibular cochlear nerve do? You can explain that to me. Or if I were to say, what is the CN9? You would need to be able to explain that. You then also need to be able to match the function to the name or number. So if I were to give you the function of processing visual information, we have only talked about one type of cranial nerve that processes visual information, and that would be the one that is processing vision. So that's the optic nerve. But if I were asking about controlling motor in general, I would also want to include the motor of my eyes to be able to say that that is a type of motor movement. So with this identification of name, number, and matching the function, you do need to be able to do that. You also need to be able to find on the brain. So this will be done by a picture of what is in your lab manual, or this will be done by a picture of past labs where we've been able to use models. But if you are talking about the nerve abducens, which is cranial nerve 6, you can then go to the brain and be able to identify cranial nerve 6. So for this section on cranial nerves, this is your biggest chunk. So the easiest way to remember this is obviously just go down the list. Number, name, go by the starting letter for all of these. So the one I learned is no longer a valid mnemonic because they changed some of the names, but I learned it on Old Olympus Towering Tops. A Finn and German then did some hops. So they've actually changed the names a little bit since my turn. So I would Google mnemonics and see what you can find and see which one sounds helpful for you to remember. They're not all PG, just as an FYI. And then you need to be able to know the function. So all of these are going to have a starting point where you need to know sensory, sensory, motor, motor, both. Motor, sensory, motor. Both might also be called mixed, if that's helpful. So as you're going through this, look at the first initial to be able to help guide you with your mnemonic of what things mean. One thing I want to highlight is for the hypoglossal, we did say that it had motor, but not a lot of sensory, but it is going to fall into the category of both. That would also go for the vagus nerve. So these three nerves do have a sensory component. It's not the strongest. It's not the most prominent, but they are considered mixed nerves. So that is the focus for this exercise. I'm looking at the gross anatomy of the brain, exercise 17.